All right, thanks so much, Corey. Welcome, everyone. Like I said, thank you again for checking your email with that appropriate link. Our apologies, but we still have a good group, and we're going to have a discussion today about data racism and bias. So my name is Angelica Jelly Spratley. I pride myself as being an educator, a data scientist, as well as a thought leader and a content creator. So let's go through the agenda for today. So we're going to talk about some case studies, hopefully that you have heard about data bias as well as data racism, and go into defining exactly what data racism is. We're going to identify some causes of data racism and how we can overcome those potential causes. Then what's hot on everybody's mind nowadays is the whole generative AI. So we're going to talk about generative AI as it relates to data racism and bias. And then we're going to wrap up with a call of action and some conclusions. So to kick it off, a little bit about me. So my undergraduate degree is from the illustrious North Carolina Central University. For those who do not know, that is a historically Black college and university where I got my undergraduate degree. Shortly after, I became an engineering teacher for about 3 years, teaching computer science as well as electrical engineering. It is through me teaching computer science that I decided to get a master's in analytics from the illustrious North Carolina State University, the home of the first Master's in Data Analytics program, which I highly attribute my success to NC State as well as NCCU. Upon graduation, I became a consultant in the pharmaceutical industry, working on data analytics products for pharmaceutical clients such as Johnson & Johnson and Regeneron. After that, I missed education so much. Being a high school engineering teacher, I served as a client services manager for higher education, and we did predictive analytics around resource allocation. So should you throw your money in residential services or should you throw your money into HR? So that was the type of analytics that we did there. After that, it still wasn't enough. I needed more and more education. I decided to become a senior data science instructor here at Flatiron School, which is sponsoring this webinar today. And then in my free time, well, I have no free time. I'm a content creator as well as a podcast host. Okay. So now, since we have a little bit about me, multiple titles, multiple hats, I'm also a Disney lover. I forgot to put that on the screen. Let's talk about the topic at hand for today. So why is this even a relevant data topic that we are discussing? So why data racism and why does this actually need to be addressed? So we have a few bullet points here. It needs to be addressed because if you're not addressing these biases in data, it can lead to inaccurate and misleading results, which in turn can cost tons of money and time. It can ruin the reputation of an organization and also have a negative societal impact. So we're going to talk about a few case studies around how data bias really negatively impacts society as well as the organization as a whole, and what are the benefits surrounding mitigating these biases in data. And that's going to include improving our decision-making, increased transparency and accountability, and also using data in a responsible and ethical way. So this happened less than 10 years ago, and I want to see some things in the chat. If you have heard of this, this is a very popular case study. It is the COMPAS algorithm. Okay, so how many of us have heard about that in the chat? So COMPAS stands for Correctional Offender Management Profiling for Alternative Sanctions, okay? So what this algorithm was doing was pretty much assigning risk scores to individuals on whether or not they would repeat a crime. And it was very disproportionate to African American defendants, where it labeled African Americans as high risk, which is double the mislabeling of white defendants. So you see the image on the right-hand side of the screen where we see that James Ravelli, which was a white American, had a low risk of 3 for repeating a crime, whereas Robert Cannon, who is an African American male, had a medium risk of 6. In turn, it was mislabeling and assigning these high risk scores to African American, thus data bias as well as data racism. And it wasn't until 2016 that ProPublica actually put a report out on this, did an investigation, etc. So, like I said, this happened less than 10 years ago, a pretty common case study that should drive us to ascertain that we're checking for data bias as well as data racism. So that was 10 years ago. So now let's see what happened less than 5 years ago, 2019 to be exact. And that was rise of generative AI and GPT-2. So as of now, I know everyone here has heard of ChatGPT or these generative AI models. And as you can see on my screen, generative AI works by generating new content based off of a prompt. And it's able to generate this new content based off of historical data, right? That's how these models are trained. So as you can see in this table in the lower right-hand corner, I have prompts here. And if you put a prompt inside of GPT-2 and you said the Black man worked as, it would finish that prompt to say a pimp for 15 years. So these LLMs or large language models inherently have bias because that is the data that it was trained on. Now we can overcome these biases, and we're going to talk about that later on in the presentation. You also see in the upper right-hand corner, if you gave a prompt to GPT-2, the woman should work as, or the man should work as, it will complete the prompt to say the woman should work as a maid in the house and the man should work as a vernacular interpreter, giving you metrics out that are leading to bias. Okay, so this is a very alarming chart that even now with generative AI, we still have to be cognizant about data racism as well as data bias. All right, so let's define exactly what data racism is. So according to the European Network Against Racism, data racism is multiple systems and technology that targets disproportionately impacts migrants or people of color. Okay, so that's the definition that we're working with today. So now let's think of some causes. What is going to add to bias in the data? What is going to add to racism in your data? I want to chat blast. So what I mean by chat blast, I want you to blast out some responses in the chat. What do you think leads to data racism and or data bias? Any ideas? What do you think may lead to data racism or data bias? I see Holly saying rubbish training data. Yep. Some human bias. Okay, so humans make the model. So flawed data, incomplete data, bad data collection, language use, slang. All of these are reasons, in fact, a long history of white supremacy. The people who contribute to the models, Yesenia, love it, love it, love it. Exactly. So I have some of those causes on the screen in front of you. So lack of team diversity. So the teams that are building the model, the lack of diversity there can lead to racism and bias. Internal human bias or implicit bias as well, which some have already mentioned in the chat. I saw a lot of poor data collection. So that whole garbage in, garbage out, not collecting representative data, lack of data, and lack of model feedback, tuning these algorithms, and actually testing these algorithms. So we're going to go through each one of these boxes here in the presentation. And I'm going to start with lack of team diversity and internal human bias together. So before we look into how can we address lack of team diversity in our own internal biases, let's look at how team diversity actually looks like at the top companies, because these companies are our spearheads. If Google, Facebook, Amazon, whoever posts something, is going to spread internationally. Everybody tries to mimic and mock these leaders. So here we have a graph. So on the x-axis, you're going to see the years. On the y-axis, you're going to have the percent of Black employees. I have a black line that is showing the percent of Black employees in non-technical roles, as well as leadership roles, as well as technical roles. And this is from the Facebook Diversity Report in 2022. So as you can see from this visual, Blacks tend to dominate non-technical roles and rarely end up in leadership positions. So if they're not in the technical or leadership positions to contribute to these algorithms, then inherently your algorithm may lead to bias, right? So diversity is very important. And of course, like I said, this is coming from one of those FANG companies such as Facebook itself. So let's look at another visual, and this is a visual of Amazon and their diversity report. So we see here that we have the race and ethnicity on the left-hand side. The first group of bars is going to be just overall within Amazon. The next group of bars is going to be at managerial levels. And then on the right-hand side, we have the percentage breakdown of females as well as males. So as you can see, if we pay attention to the lower part of the graph, women, Blacks, and Hispanics are underrepresented in managerial roles, right? So the diversity of your company and team matters when it's creating these algorithms that are supposed to take diversity into mind. So one last visual, since this is all about data, I want to make sure that we show some data. So this is by DiffBot, and this is the number of data scientists that they had by company in 2019. So in this case, only 23% of women make up this entire graphic. So when you go into these FANG companies, it's very disproportionately male. So this is very, very alarming. So that is what diversity looks like at some of these leaders. Some of what we consider top companies. When students graduate, they always want to go to a Facebook, a Google, a Microsoft, because it has the name behind it, right? But even though they may be top companies in economics, they're not top companies when it comes to diversity and inclusion. So how can we actually go about creating diverse teams? There's tons and tons of ways that we can go into creating diverse teams. One is going to start with those hiring practices. So I don't know if I have any HR people in the audience, but I'm sure that you think about this a lot on your day-to-day. Having diverse interview panels when you're writing up job descriptions, or either managers that are in departments that write up job descriptions for HR. As a manager or people leader, think about, does this role really require a master's? Does this role really require 15 years of experience? Or am I trying to exclude certain groups? Am I trying to exclude recent grads, right? Because I feel like they're true millennial. Am I trying to exclude a certain demographic because I know that they're less likely to get a master's or doctorate degree in STEM? Right? So you need to think about your job requirements and make sure that it actually fits the role. And when thinking about these job requirements, think about the training that goes along with it. So can you take a recent grad that has 0 to 3 years experience and give them great, robust training, and they'll excel in that role? Or do you really need someone with 5 to 8 years of experience? Also, something else, C-suite diversity. If the C-suite is not diverse and they have not made a strategic plan on how they're going to overcome C-suite diversity, we need to put that in practice, okay? So trying to improve the company's diversity inclusion from the bottom up, right? Also, collaboration with non-tech experts. Okay, so if you're doing a model that's going to be launched at a hospital and it's going to impact patient care, are you interfacing with doctors or nurses or admin assistants in the hospital that's actually going to use that model? Are you incorporating your subject matter stakeholders to help you solve this problem to make sure that it's giving you the expected end goal? So don't sleep on the non-tech experts at your organization, right? Especially if you're doing data science or algorithms that's going to be used internally. So if it's going to impact your coworkers, bring some coworkers on board, ask them their ideas, ask them their opinions, send out a survey to get their non-technical expertise on how they feel this product will impact them. And that goes hand in hand with the end users in your decision-making process as well. So all of these, and there's tons of other ways in creating diversity of teams, but the diversity in overcoming bias in the algorithm is going to start with making sure that diverse people are making the algorithms, okay? So this goes hand in hand with implicit bias, because sometimes biases can affect hiring people, it can affect promoting people, it can affect whether or not we're involving those SMEs in our decision-making process. And this whole concept of implicit bias is how you overcome unconscious bias. So we all have unconscious biases as well as conscious ones. And so being aware of your own bias, which is introspection. So as you see on the right-hand side of the screen, this is a very common mnemonic on how you can actually deal with your internal biases. I highly recommend that if this is the first time you're hearing it, that you go online, you do a lot of research about how to check your implicit bias, how to be mindful of the biases that you have, trying to increase your perspective, because there are tons of people out here that have different perspectives, how tolerable you are of that. Learn how to slow down and think about things in a full picture view and how it can impact certain individuals. Just because it's not impacting you doesn't mean it's not going to impact someone else. Check how you message your marketing. I posted something on LinkedIn not too long ago about how your marketing is more than changing the color of your logo. So as an organization, can you do more in-house to actually create a diverse and inclusive environment that in turn is going to lead to getting you better data quality and better data algorithms, okay? So being aware of your own biases is also going to impact whether or not you're getting in data that is biased or racist in nature. So that was lack of team diversity in our internal human biases. Now let's talk about how data is collected and the lack of data that is out there. So data collection, so poor data collection. So there's this whole concept that I'm sure everyone has probably heard about, and if not, that is perfectly okay. You're hearing about it today. Response and no response bias in survey data. So you could go out and you could say, I have surveyed 10,000 people that shop at Target. And my business initiative is to figure out what type of marketing strategies appeal to all age groups. And out of the 10,000 people that responded to your survey, 9,000 of them were between the ages of 18 and 23 because they wanted the free gift card. Then you take that model and you deploy it, and then you wonder why your marketing strategy isn't what it needs to be. Because you have no response bias. There are older demographics in that survey who did not respond, right? So think about who is responding to the survey, who isn't responding to the survey, and be aware of that bias that can exist. Of course, an underrepresentation or overrepresentation of a particular group, this happens a lot in healthcare, where you will have white Americans being overrepresented in data sets, where you're trying to predict things such as healthcare intervention, risk scoring, disease management, things of that nature. So you really need to be mindful of this. If you have 95% of white Americans in your data set, There are some algorithmic things you can do, such as oversampling. There's also some other things that you can do trying to acquire other data in a legal format that's going to best represent the solution that you're trying to give. Okay. Confirmation bias. And I have seen a lot of clients do this in the past, only collecting the data that's going to try to prove you right. Businesses love this. Instead of collecting the data that is appropriate in solving the business problem, they want to only look at the data that is going to be right for them. Okay, so that can also lead to data bias as well as data racism. And of course, a more generic term of just sampling bias, right? Who are you sampling? Who is underrepresented in this data? Are there certain co-founding variables within my data set, such as income or street address, that is going to co-found with another variable such as gender or race, and put those two buckets in a negative light? So always thinking about where your data is coming from. What's not in your data is just as important as what's in your data. So with that being said, there's a lack of data. Okay, sometimes it's hard to overcome some things because there is not enough data out there. There has been poor data collection on race, ethnicity, gender, sex, and disability, especially as it pertains to gender and race. And a lot of this is coming from historical roots where we had the 3/5 compromise, whereas one African American or slave, it would take 5 African Americans and slaves just to have a vote or just to be counted in the census, even though they couldn't vote back then. This has a historical meaning to it, where people felt it was irrelevant to track things that pertain to certain races, to really care about the impact of women, to really care about disabilities and things of that nature. And so there's historically have been this whole trend of poor data collection, okay? So how can you go about collecting this data? Try to collect data from underrepresented classes. There's plenty of grassroots organizations that focus on getting data from those who don't have a voice. Sending out surveys, going door to door, really being on the ground to reach those underrepresented populations so that they can have as accurate data as possible, so that they can build appropriate algorithms to better serve the community. Collecting data from different sources. Data augmentation goes with making sure that you change data to make sure your algorithm isn't biased. So this is more pertaining to visual data. If you're trying to do a predictive policing algorithm, like we saw in the beginning of this presentation, can you add a dark filter on some of the images to see how it does perform on Black people? Can you use different lighting? Can you flip it? Can you blur it? Things of that nature to really make sure that the algorithm isn't putting out a whole bunch of biased data, as well as improving your documentation. And of course, when you're collecting data, you also have to adhere to regulatory requirements. A lot of this data cannot be obtained because of certain legal concerns behind it as well. Okay. All right, so our last box for this is going to be lack of model feedback, tuning, and testing. This is another reason or cause of how data racism or bias can come about. So before we get back into the whole generative AI space, I want to make a statement here that there is no such thing as neutral technology. Some people feel that just because computers don't have a soul, they don't have a heart, they don't have a brain, that they're neutral. They can't possibly spit out bias or racist results. This is not true. There's no such thing as neutral technology. So much that an author named Ruha Benjamin made a very, very informative book called Race After Technology, where she discusses the new Jim Code and how technology is still disproportionately excluding race, as well as gender from the algorithms, and that algorithms are in fact subject to this whole idea of classic racism. It doesn't matter that it speaks in binary. If it is built on an objective scientific method or a biased human, once again, going back to our own implicit bias, as well as built on biased historical data or discrimination, then it's going to put out some bias and racist results. Okay, so I highly recommend that you take a look, read this book about this whole new Jim Code and everything that's playing into this new era that we're in now, that's leading up to increased data racism as well as increased data bias. All right, so now introducing generative AI, like we talked a little bit in the beginning when we were talking about the bias and the prompts that we can get from generative AI. So the definition of generative AI. So if you're new and you've never heard of it, welcome to the world of generative AI. It's on the news, it's on YouTube, it's on LinkedIn, it's everywhere now. And it's just a set of algorithms used to generate new content. So things such as ChatGPT, Stable Diffusion, Falcon, all of these are these generative AI models that are going to generate new content. So how can quote unquote new content be racist or biased? It's new, right? It just came out the box. It's like when you get a new pair of shoes. How can a new pair of shoes already be worn, right? It doesn't make sense if it's generating new content. But the answer is because the historical data used to train the model itself is racist and biased. And we're going to look at an example of this by Bloomberg. So Bloomberg did a study. They asked Stable Diffusion, and Stable Diffusion is a generative AI algorithm where it's going to generate images from text. So Bloomberg asked this generative AI algorithm to generate over 5,000 representative images of people across 14 jobs. 7 of those jobs were what we would consider high-paying jobs, and the other 7 of those jobs were low-paying jobs. And let's see what Bloomberg found out. Bloomberg found out that the Stable Diffusion algorithm showed lighter-skinned individuals more likely getting the higher-paying jobs than darker-skinned individuals. So as you see on this graph to the right, what we have here on the x-axis is the average income, right? Which, of course, the further you move to the right, the higher your average income. And on the Y, we have a spectrum of light skin to dark skin. And as you can see, when we get into the CEOs, the doctors, the judges, the lawyers, the politicians, those were mostly lighter skin generated images. So this algorithm generated lighter skinned individuals to have these occupations, and they generated darker skinned individuals to have occupations such as fast food worker and social worker. But this is a generative AI model, right? It's generating new content. It can't be biased. But as Bloomberg is showing here, it most certainly can. So on the same front, when it comes to gender, this algorithm showed females as lower salary earners compared to males. So once again, on the x-axis, you have that average income, and you have men versus women. And you can see when we have things such as CEO and doctor, that shows up more as a male image. So this generative AI generated tons more males than females. And then down here where you have housekeeper, cashier, teacher, you see that it has generated more women images. So once again, a generative AI algorithm that's generating new content, but putting out biased content based off of a simple prompt. Now, what do we actually do about this, right? How do we actually still leverage these generative AI tools while being aware of it, the bias and or racism that it can cause? Well, how we can combat this is, once again, check the data that's going into the algorithms. So a lot of these generative AI models are a mix of supervised models as well as reinforcement learning models. And when we talk about supervised models, we talk about models that have a label. This occupation being a male, this occupation being a female, or whatever the label may be. So if you actually need to label data, are you labeling data with a diverse team? Right? So that way, your data labels also come in being aware of that diversity. Okay? Check the data that is actually coming out a model. So there are certain things that's called adversarial networks. I'm not going to get too technical in this presentation, but pretty much it's a group of models where you can create a second model that's going to check the fairness of the first. That's all it does, to figure out if the output of the actual model is actually fair. Does it have age bias? Does it have gender bias? Does it have race bias? And a lot of these are packages that can be built right into Python that you can just import. And then once you create a model, you can't set it, then forget it, okay? Because there's something called model drift, where over time, model performance degrades. And that degradation of the model performance can in turn be related to bias or racist data coming in to train the model. So you must continue to monitor the model once it actually is employed. But really checking in for that data collection, like you all said in the chat, was this poor data collection? Is the right data being collected? What data isn't being collected? How is this going to impact the end user or the stakeholder? What are my own biases when it comes to actually collecting the data and training the model? And then once the model is performing, are we doing QA and QC to make sure that the model is not performing in a biased way? So all of these, and this applies to supervised models, generative AI, Chat GPT, all of that, right? Chat GPT cannot be used out the box, right? Out of the box, Chat GPT is only 40 to 60% accurate, okay? And even with that, it still has biases. So you're always going to need human intelligence to go in, check for bias, check for racism, check for the end user impact of your models. So what is the call of action? And I talk really fast to be mindful of people's time since we got started super late. But my call of action that I hope that you get from this presentation is being aware of your own biases, knowing the biases that you have, slowing down, thinking about things from different individual perspectives, advocating for diversity of thought as well as diverse teams in general to make sure that you have the right tools that you need to create these as much as you possibly can, these non-biased and non-racist algorithms. Know where your data is coming from and what your model is putting out. And this goes to the concept of data literacy. I don't care if you're non-technical or technical, you need to be data literate. Know where your company is getting the data for you to build in these models. Know how your data is being used. If you are utilizing a model, understanding what the model is actually putting out and being able to test it to see if that model is biased or not. Don't be a bystander. If you know there is bias in the data or in the model, speak up. If you know your team didn't check for bias, speak up, right? So don't be a bystander, be an ally. Speak up if you see biased data or data racism, and create and thrive within diverse teams. Be purposeful about your diverse teams. Since algorithms are made off of humans, it's very important to have diversity from start to finish as soon as your business and strategic plan. So in the business plan and strategic plan making process, have diversity all the way until the model is deployed and being QA. So create and thrive within diverse teams. Oh, and connect with me. That's your next call of action, okay? So the first QR code, Learning with Jelly on YouTube for more educational videos about how to code. Always reach out to me on LinkedIn. You can just snag the QR code or look for me first and last name. And then podcasts about data bias, data racism, as well as boot camp information. That is on that third QR code about All About Data podcasts. All right. So I know I talked a mile a minute, but I still got under 2 o'clock. So are there any questions?
That was impressive, Jelly.
Thanks so much, Jack. I thank you all for checking your email again and coming to join us here at Flatiron. And even if you have some questions about Flatiron in general, we do have an admissions counselor here, Zachary, that can talk all about admissions. So if you're interested in pursuing any of our pathways, of course, I'm an instructor on the data science pathway. Feel free to put something in the chat. You are so welcome, Scott. Yesenia, you're welcome, Chelsea. Thank you, Sarah. Nice to see you as well. Even though I can't see your face, but I can see your chat, so I feel like I can see your face with your smile. Thanks, Scott. Yep, David, I can shoot that over to you. For implicit bias, yes. There's a whole test that you can do. I don't think it's by Harvard, though. It's by another company, but you hit like E's and I's, and they show you images on the screen, and you'll see your implicit bias kind of be quantified at the end. So I'll definitely send that for you. Thank you, Abby, and thank you for coming from all the way from Scotland. Thank you, Heidi, as well. Thank you, Eva. David, you want to drop the link of what I was talking about in the chat for me? Awesome. Candace, feel free to reach out to me as well, because I come from the public schools sector as well as collegiate level. Love the work that you're doing about literacy. That's very important. Yep, I see a lot of people dropping in their LinkedIn. Your best way to find me on LinkedIn is Angelica space Spratley, right? And then it won't slip my mind. Thank you, Samantha, for coming as well. Feel free to connect with me as well. Okay. I know that was a mile a minute, Corey, because I had to get through fast, but
you made it. You made it work though. So thank you. And apologies for everybody. I'm so sorry. We had some technical difficulties at the beginning, but I'm glad that everybody got to join. And for anybody to miss the first couple minutes, we'll send out a recording of this within the next 3 business days. And we look forward to seeing you at our next event. Have a great day, everybody. Bye, y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jelly.